The story of the young man who disappeared in the mountains and was never found. What workers discovered. 5 years later, shocked everyone. In the summer of 1978, in the quiet suburbs of Eugene, Oregon, 21-year-old Samuel Tucker was preparing for a trip he had taken every year since he was 16. With his trademark curly hair and that easygoing smile, Sam was the kind of young man everyone liked, kind, patient, and always curious about the world around him. He had a gentle way of talking and a love for nature that seemed to set him apart. That morning, he folded his sleeping bag, packed a small backpack with a journal, a couple of sandwiches his mother had made, a map, and a camera. He had a favorite spot up in the Cascade Mountains, a secluded area near a lake surrounded by pine trees, where he would spend a few days alone, reading, writing, and watching the stars. His mother, Elaine, stood by the kitchen doorway as he zipped his bag. She tried to keep her voice light, but there was a tension in her eyes. "Don't forget to check in on the radio every evening." Sam smiled and kissed her on the cheek. "Always do." His younger sister, Annie, 12 at the time, followed him outside barefoot, clutching a cold glass of lemonade. "Bring me back a cool rock," she said. Sam laughed. "Only if it's shiny." The last thing the family saw was his beat-up green station wagon driving away into the distance, dust trailing behind it under the golden morning sun. The first evening came and went. No check-in. Elaine told herself it was the mountains. The radio signal was always spotty up there. But on the second day, the silence stretched a little too long. By the third day, she called the local ranger station. Her voice was calm but filled with an anxious urgency. "My son, he went camping a few days ago and he usually checks in. He hasn't called." The ranger promised to send someone to look. It was probably nothing. Campers got caught up in the moment all the time. But something in her voice stayed with him. And that was the beginning. The trip that started like every summer before it. The goodbye that no one knew was the last. 2 park rangers arrived at the trailhead by noon the next day, maps folded under their arms and radio static humming softly in the background. They had been told this was routine, a precaution more than a real emergency. Samuel Tucker was an experienced hiker, familiar with the area, and the weather had been clear all week. They followed the route Elaine had described, the one Sam always used. It led through a narrow path of tall trees and rocky ground, up toward a ridge that overlooked a quiet alpine lake. After nearly 3 hours of walking, they found his car parked just off a dirt road, tucked neatly beneath the trees, as if waiting. Nothing about the car seemed out of place. Keys were gone, windows up, doors locked. A clean thermos sat in the passenger seat. A paperback novel lay face down on the dashboard. It looked like someone had just stepped out for a walk. They radioed in their position and started up the trail on foot. Near sunset, they found Sam's campsite. The tent was still standing. Inside were his rolled-up sleeping bag, his journal, a flashlight, and a half-eaten sandwich. But Sam was not there. No sign of a struggle, no blood, no damage to the area. Just quiet. As if he had stood up mid-thought and wandered off. One of the rangers flipped through the journal. The last entry was dated the night before he was supposed to return. Stillness. It's strange how peaceful it can feel to be completely alone. The trees don't ask questions, the stars don't rush you. Maybe this is where I feel most like myself. The words were thoughtful, calm, no indication of fear, sadness, or plans to leave. That night, the rangers called in a report. The next morning, a formal search began, volunteers, dogs, helicopters. The family watched from below as strangers walked the hills where Sam once laughed, once explored. Elaine sat on the porch, phone in hand, staring at the mountains in the distance. Her husband George paced inside, organizing maps and notes, refusing to give in to fear. Annie, too young to understand the weight of it all, sat in Sam's room staring at the empty bed, hoping this was all just a delay. She kept expecting the phone to ring, someone to knock, the door to open, but day after day nothing came. They found no tracks, no belongings beyond the tent, no evidence of wild animals or a fall. By the end of the first week, the local papers began to call it the vanishing, and for the first time the Tucker family started to realize this might not be a search for a lost hiker. It might be the beginning of a life without him. Summer faded into autumn, and the search for Samuel Tucker slowly shifted from urgent to uncertain. The once busy trails filled with rangers and volunteers turned quiet again. The helicopters no longer flew overhead. The posters, once fresh and bright, began to curl at the corners and fade under rain and wind. Elaine sat at the kitchen table each morning, clutching the same mug of coffee she never drank. Her hands trembled a little more each day. She stopped cooking for a while. Sam's favorite meals were too painful to prepare. Instead, she stared out the window at the road, waiting for the shape of his car to reappear at the curve like it always had. George buried himself in facts. He pinned maps across the garage wall, marking routes, calculating distances between the car and the campsite, between the campsite and the cliffs, between his hope and reality. He called the sheriff's office twice a week, asking the same questions, getting the same answers. "Nothing new today, Mr. Tucker, but we haven't forgotten about your son." But it felt like everyone else had. Annie, now in middle school, grew quieter. She stopped telling jokes. She didn't play with the other kids at recess. She began carrying Sam's old compass in her backpack, spinning the dial during lunch and staring at it like it held a secret she was too young to understand. She still kept the promise she made, to leave his room untouched. She dusted the bookshelf. She laid out a clean pair of socks on his pillow every Sunday, just in case. As weeks turned to months, the family learned to live in the stillness. It was not peace, it was something heavier. A kind of waiting that settled into the walls of their home. Thanksgiving came. An extra plate was set untouched. Christmas arrived. No one opened presents. The neighbors, once so supportive, stopped knocking. People grew quiet when the Tuckers walked into church. Some avoided eye contact. Others offered clumsy sympathy that always ended with, "He was such a good boy." Elaine sometimes sat in the living room late at night, whispering into the dark, "Where are you, Sam?" as if he could hear. One evening, Annie asked her father, "Do you think he's still out there?" George looked at her. His voice was soft, but his eyes were hard. "I don't know, but I think if he could come home, and he would have by now." That night, Annie wrote in her notebook, "He's not gone. He's just somewhere we don't know how to reach." And though they tried to move forward, every birthday, every sunset, every quiet night by the fire reminded them of who was missing. Samuel Tucker hadn't just disappeared into the woods. He had vanished from 100 little moments that made their family whole. 5 years passed. The world moved on. Cars changed, fashion changed, music changed. But inside the Tucker household, time moved differently. It moved slower, heavier, like walking through deep snow. The pain of losing Sam had not dulled. It had only grown quieter, like a hum beneath everything they did. Elaine had returned to her part-time job at the local library. She smiled when necessary, helped students find books, and kept a small photo of Sam tucked inside her daily planner. Every time she opened it, his face smiled back, caught forever in the summer of '78. George no longer called the sheriff's office. He had accepted that the lines of investigation had long gone cold. He now focused on fixing things, doors, fences, anything around the house that gave him a task to complete, something to control. But some nights he would walk out onto the porch alone and stare at the mountains, hands in his pockets, silent. Annie was now 17. She had grown into a thoughtful, quiet young woman, with Sam's same steady gaze. His disappearance had shaped her childhood like a shadow, long and constant. She still kept his compass, still wrote in the notebook she started when he vanished. She had filled it with letters to him, sketches of mountains, and questions she couldn't ask out loud. Then came the phone call. It was late October 1983, just before Halloween, when the county office reached out. A construction team, working on an access road deeper into the forest where Sam had once camped, had uncovered something buried beneath a tangle of roots. A small, weathered wooden box. At first, no one connected it to Sam. The area had been inaccessible for years. But when the sheriff's department opened the box, they found something that changed everything. Inside were several photographs, a bundle of neatly folded papers, and a sealed envelope with Tucker written in faded ink. The sheriff called George that same evening. By morning, George, Elaine, and Annie sat together in the county office as an officer placed the box gently on the table. No one spoke for a long moment. Then Elaine reached out, fingers trembling, and opened the envelope. It was Sam's handwriting. They knew it instantly. "If you're reading this, it means you found me in some way. I hope you're okay. I hope you're not angry. I needed to go, and I didn't know how to explain why. His words were calm, reflective. He spoke about feeling lost in a world that was moving too fast, about needing silence, about trying to find who he really was. He said he meant no harm, no pain, that it was never about running away from them, but towards something inside himself. The photos showed him sitting by a campfire standing near the lake, smiling with a book in his hands. They were taken with his own camera, ones he had never returned to share. There was no body, no blood, no sign of violence or finality. Just this box buried like a time capsule waiting to be found. Annie stared at the photos in. The news of the discovery spread quickly through the small community of Eugene. Local headlines read, "New clues found in 5-year-old case of missing camper." Neighbors who had long stopped asking questions began whispering again. But for the Tucker family, the outside noise didn't matter. They had something more valuable now, Sam's voice. At home that evening, the three of them sat in the living room, the lights dim, the wooden box open on the coffee table between them. The letter was read again, slowly, this time by Annie. Her voice trembled only once when Sam wrote, "I don't expect you to understand, but please believe this. I never stopped loving you. I just didn't know how to live the way everyone expected me to." Elaine clutched one of the photos to her chest. It was Sam sitting by the lake, staring into the distance with a soft, unreadable expression. He looked healthy, calm, like he had made peace with something the rest of them never saw coming. For George, the letter reopened old wounds. He couldn't understand why Sam hadn't reached out, hadn't written, hadn't found a way to say, "I'm safe." He stood quietly and walked to the porch, closing the screen door behind him. Outside, the evening air was crisp, and the mountains, those same mountains Sam had loved, stood in the distance, painted by moonlight. George whispered to no one in particular, "You should have told us. We would have understood." But deep down, he knew they hadn't understood, not back then. Maybe they were too focused on keeping life steady, too caught up in plans and responsibilities to notice that Sam had been carrying something invisible. Inside, Annie flipped through the papers in the box. There were sketches Sam had made, trees, birds, trails, and fragments of poems or thoughts. People forget how loud the world is until they hear true silence. To disappear is not always to run away. Sometimes it's to return to yourself. Each word added a new layer to the image of the brother she once knew. He hadn't been lost in the woods. He had gone somewhere deeper into himself, into solitude. The sheriff called the next morning to explain that there would be no reopening of the case. There was no evidence of a crime, no indication of foul play. What had happened, they said gently, was not a mystery in the traditional sense, but a personal journey. Legally, Sam would remain missing. There was no body, no confirmed location, no final moment. Just his words and in the silence he left behind. Elaine hung up the phone, her hand trembling. She turned to Annie and said, "I'm not sure what's harder, not knowing where he is or knowing he chose to stay away." Annie didn't respond. She walked to Sam's room, opened the door, and sat on his bed for the first time in years. The air smelled of old wood and paper. The room was frozen in time just as he had left it. She opened her notebook and began to write. "You didn't vanish. You became a quiet part of everything. The wind, the trees, the space we leave at the table." For the first time, her tears came freely, not from pain, but from a strange, aching gratitude. She missed him more than ever. But at least now she could picture where he had been, what he had seen, and maybe even who he had become. That night, the three of them sat together without speaking. The house was quiet but not empty. Something had returned to them, not Sam himself, but a piece of his truth, and that piece was enough to begin healing. Winter crept into Eugene slowly that year, as if reluctant to disturb the quiet that had settled over the Tucker household. The first snowfall dusted the streets with silence, and for the first time in 5 years, the windows of the Tucker home glowed with soft, steady warmth. The wooden box that had held Sam's final words was now placed on the mantel above the fireplace, surrounded by pine cones and a single photograph. Sam sitting by the lake, smiling gently at the camera, frozen in time. Elaine resumed old traditions in small, careful steps. She baked Sam's favorite cinnamon bread for the first time since he left. She hummed again while folding laundry. The ache hadn't disappeared, but it had changed. It was no longer sharp. It had become a kind of companion, something she could carry without breaking. George, though still quiet, began to soften. He joined a small group of local hikers who met every weekend to explore nearby trails. It wasn't about searching anymore. It was about walking in the places Sam had once loved, honoring his memory through footsteps instead of questions. When asked why he joined, George simply said, "It helps me breathe." Annie had changed too. The once quiet girl who clung to Sam's memory had grown into a thoughtful young woman, now in her final year of high school. She still carried his compass in her bag, but now it felt less like a weight and more like a connection. One afternoon she stood in front of her English class and read an essay titled, "The Brother Who Taught Me Silence." She didn't cry. Her voice was steady as she spoke of loss, love, and the strange beauty of unanswered questions. When she finished, her classmates were silent, not out of discomfort, but out of something deeper, understanding. The community, too, had changed. People no longer avoided the Tuckers in church. Instead, they greeted them with warmth, with hands on shoulders and shared nods. The story of Sam had become more than just a mystery. It had become a reminder that even in disappearance there can be meaning, that grief doesn't always come with closure, but it can still bring growth. On the first day of spring, the family visited the place where the box was found. There were no reporters, no officials, just the three of them and the forest, still quiet and somehow welcoming. They placed a simple wooden marker beneath the tree roots where the box had been buried. It read, "For Sam, who didn't get lost but went looking." Elaine placed her hand on the wood, closed her eyes, and whispered, "We forgive you." George nodded silently beside her, tears filling his eyes for the first time in years, and Annie knelt down, planting a small wildflower beside the marker. She smiled through her tears and whispered, "You're still here, I know." They stood there a while, saying nothing. The wind moved gently through the trees. No dramatic signs, no hidden clues, just nature, holding their grief with grace. They didn't need all the answers anymore. Because somehow in the stillness Sam once loved so much, they had finally heard him. The years that followed didn't erase the pain, but they softened it like water smoothing the edges of stone. The Tuckers learned how to live again, not by forgetting Sam, but by making space for his memory in everything they did. Elaine began volunteering at a local community center, helping teens who struggled with anxiety and isolation. She never spoke of Sam directly, but in every conversation, every quiet gesture of patience, he was there. She saw parts of him in those young faces, the questions they carried, the way they looked out the window during long silences. She would smile gently and say, "You're allowed to feel lost sometimes." George continued to hike. It became his rhythm, his weekly ritual. He had memorized the mountain trails not for search but for reflection. Sometimes he'd stop by the lake, Sam's lake, and sit for hours. He carried a notebook now, like Sam once did, where he wrote down thoughts, sketches, and the things he never got to say to his son. One page read, "I spent years asking why. I'm starting to ask how. How do I honor your choice even if I don't understand it?" Annie graduated with honors and left for college in Portland. Her dorm desk held two things, a small photo of Sam and the compass she had carried since she was 12. Whenever she felt overwhelmed, she would hold it, close her eyes, and imagine the sound of wind through pine trees. She studied psychology, not because she wanted to solve her brother's mystery, but because she wanted to help people like him, people who needed quiet without judgment, who felt too much, who disappeared not out of selfishness, but out of exhaustion. During her first winter break, she returned home and sat with her parents by the fireplace. It had been snowing all day. They drank cocoa and listened to the wind outside, and for the first time in years they laughed, not loudly, not carelessly, but honestly. Later that evening, Annie opened the drawer in the hallway and pulled out Sam's old journal, the one found in his tent. She read aloud one of the final entries. "The silence here isn't empty. It's full of questions I've finally stopped running from. Maybe I'm not meant to be found. Maybe I'm just meant to be remembered the right way." The room fell quiet. Not sad. Just still. Elaine reached for George's hand. Annie closed the journal and smiled through tears. Sam's absence had once been a wound. Now it was a thread, woven into their days, shaping their choices. reminding them to listen more deeply, to love more gently, to forgive more freely. They no longer asked, "Why did he leave?" They now asked, "How can we carry him forward?" And in doing so, they found him again, not on a trail, not in a photo, but in each other. 10 years after Sam's disappearance, Annie Tucker stood on a small stage at the local community center in Eugene. The chairs before her were filled with familiar faces, neighbors, teachers, old classmates, and her parents sitting together in the front row, hands intertwined. The room was quiet, expectant. She took a breath and began to speak. "I used to think closure was about finding answers, about solving something, but sometimes closure is just learning how to live with the silence." Her voice didn't shake. She had practiced this talk 100 times, but tonight it was different. This time it wasn't just for the audience, it was for Sam. Annie was now 27. She had become a counselor, working with teens and young adults, those who felt lost, unseen, unheard. She had taken the grief that once hollowed her and shaped it into purpose. Every life she touched carried a piece of Sam's legacy. That evening she shared their story. The boy who went camping and never returned, the years of aching silence, the letter buried beneath the trees, the transformation that followed. But what moved the crowd most wasn't the mystery, it was the love that endured. "He didn't vanish from our lives," she said. "He became part of how we lived them." After the event, people came forward with quiet tears, with stories of their own lost ones, with thanks. Elaine hugged each of them. George stood tall beside her, listening, no longer the man broken by the unknown, but the father who had learned to carry the weight with grace. Later that night, the family returned home. The fireplace crackled and snow tapped gently at the windows. Elaine brought out a new photo album she had been working on for years. She placed it on the table between them. It was titled, "For Sam, A Life Remembered." Inside were pictures of Sam as a child, hiking through meadows, laughing at family picnics, lying on the grass and staring at the sky. Interspersed between the photos were handwritten letters from each of them, letters they never got to send, now forever part of his story. George's letter said, "I didn't understand why you left, but I understand now that you needed something we couldn't give. I forgive you. And I hope wherever you are, you forgave me too." Elaine said, "You were never a burden. You were light even when it flickered. I would have waited a lifetime, but I'm grateful for the pieces of you we got back." And Annie's, the last in the album, read, "You taught me how to listen, to silence, to pain, to people. I still carry your compass. It's led me through life more than you'll ever know." They closed the album gently. No one cried that night. Instead, they sat together in the warmth, surrounded by love, by memory, by something both fragile and unbreakable. Sam's story had no ending, but it had meaning, and maybe that was enough. Because some people don't need to be found to be remembered.